We'd firstly like to begin by presenting an acknowledgement to the country that we're joining this conference from the Gadigal land of the Illawarra Nation in Australia, and we pay respects to the traditional owners of that land, which was never ceded. Our presentation today is titled Informality as Deregulation, the story of granny flats in New South Wales, Australia. And I present this together with Professor Nicole Gurran from the School of Architecture, Design and Planning, the University of Sydney. This project, this presentation today is part of an ongoing Australian Research Council project, which we have just begun this year. So it is an ongoing research and the findings are quite preliminary. So I would like to just mention that right at the beginning. And I apologize that it's almost midnight here, so my voice might be going down a bit. So we begin with the title of this presentation, which is Informality as Deregulation. And we take it back to Ananya Roy and what Roy mentions as informality as deregulation, and she sort of situates informality within the wider context of neoliberal economic processes. And what she does is she actually distinguishes between unregulated and deregulated systems. So by deregulation or deregulated system, what she means is the potential withdrawal of regulatory power. And in the article, she is taking the case of Calcutta in India and saying that this may be enabling some form of calculated informality. So here, the state definitely is not, it's not the total negation of the state. The state is deeply involved, but involved in a way that may enable a certain type of informality. So this has been taken further by Durston Wigman in their typology and taking informality specifically in relation to planning and building rules in relation to housing practices. And they've come up with three key terminologies: informality as non-compliance, informality as non-enforcement, and informality as deregulation. So the third one will be the focus of our presentation today. And this is in relation, we're taking deregulation further down into specifically planning and building rules in terms of housing. There have been various articles, literature emerging on informality and the relationship between deregulation and secondary dwelling units. So it goes from Jake again to Jake Wigman again to Vinit Mukherjee to Richard Harris. So this is more specifically very niche literature on secondary dwellings and deregulation, and also informality. So in the case of Australia, urban deregulation has been considered a response to housing affordability, and where the market is seen as the potential best place to address unmet housing needs. So it's more specifically concerned with deregulation of residential planning control as a strategy for enabling new and diverse housing production. So in this study, in this presentation, we examine one such strategy of focusing on planning reform designed to enable secondary dwellings to be constructed as of right in residential zones in New South Wales within Australia. What we're looking at specifically is the Affordable Rental Housing SEP. So SEP is the State Environmental Planning Policy, which overrules the local environmental planning policy. And this is more specifically concerned with one part, an important part of this reform is concerning secondary dwellings within residential zones. And within New South Wales, this this reform has been instrumental in terms of legalizing secondary dwellings by relaxing residential zoning rules. The main research questions for this paper, for this presentation today, is what are the implications of deregulating residential planning control for the production of secondary dwellings or granny flats, also known as in New South Wales, and what forms of calculated informality were enabled as a result of this deregulation. A research method, as I also mentioned earlier, this is part of an ongoing ARC project led by Professor Nicole Gurran, and we are in the early stages of the whole research, but we're basically relying on primary data sources such as interviews, focus group discussions with private developers, state, local government planners. And for this paper, we're also relying on policy documents, newspaper archives, and also geographic study of spatial representation of secondary dwellings. In terms of the history of granny flats within Australia and also specifically New South Wales, it has gone through a journey of being unregulated to being regulated, and then again now being deregulated. So the process has been a curve of being approved, then not being opposed, and then now being deregulated. What the reform means specifically in terms of granny flats is that it's, as I mentioned earlier, it's overturned the local controls on secondary dwellings, and it has enabled private building certifiers to approve compliant plans. So this is in many ways a pathway towards secondary dwelling construction. And this is primarily intended to provide certainty to homeowners and the construction industry. So going to our first question, the implications for the production of secondary dwellings. So in terms of the viewpoints from local council, what they're saying is that granny flats were definitely not permitted prior to affordable rental housing SEP, and SEP now has sort of overridden council plans. It is definitely tick all the boxes for compliant development. So it does not have to have a proper development application. If it's compliant, you can construct it. So there's less time in terms of the development application. So it has definitely enabled new industry. So these are the most major players in New South Wales that have been brought about only after 2009. And they basically say SEP is the entire difference. There was no granny flat industry prior to SEP, full stop. And it has definitely given certainty to the players, to these major players that have been born out of the SEP. And there has been a definite increase, rapid increase in new supply. So prior to SEP, there was literally a non-existence of granny flats. Now you can see these are only major players, and a 10-year period, you can see the exponential rise of granny flats within New South Wales. This is only New South Wales. And spatially, these are a new supply. So this is where Sydney is, and these are the regional areas where granny flat growth has picked up, primarily because of affordable rental housing SEP. This is particularly, if we go back to the earlier slide, you can see this concentration and these suburbs that have maximum granny flat production. And this is a view of one particular suburb within the western part of Sydney. And you can see the sort of horizontal densification, as Wigman terms it. So there's literally every lot has a secondary dwelling. And according to the private developers we've interviewed, this is like the top most suburb is Blacktown. And that is the image that I showed earlier. And as you can see, there has been a slight drop in the number of granny flat constructions within the suburb, within Blacktown itself, and the others as well. But what they're saying for Blacktown is that now the local council is sort of saying no more granny flats. And they are basically saying they're basically using technical reasons to say no to granny flats. And that is potentially the reason why there is a fall in granny flats within that particular suburb. So there is, the council is opposing or pushing back on granny flats. And another way that private developers are saying that council is opposing granny flats would be, or secondary dwellings would be through boosting contribution charges. So for example, this is the contribution charge for granny flat, whereas a normal contribution flat for a primary dwelling is about 20,000. So it's equivalent to that. So you would say that they do not want, at least this council does not want any more granny flats in their local area. So what forms of informality this may be resulting in? So there's definitely new private industry that has evolved as a result of this secondary dwelling and SEP. And then also this has been in many ways advertised or it generated new investment strategies for property owners and landlords. And there is, ironically, there's no requirement for affordable rent. So it's not, there is no enforcement on affordable rent. It has to be affordable, although this is a result or an implication of an affordable rental housing SEP. There is no requirement or enforcement in terms of affordable rent provisions. And it is definitely promoted as enabling a new industry and industry as an investment strategy. So you can say that it's a trick that can triple your rent. So it is potentially an investment strategy that it is being promoted as. And in terms of residential quality and residence outcome, SEP, it requires better housing quality than conversion of garages. Local council concerns over privacy conflicts between tenants. There is a rise of primary, secondary dwelling typologies rather than the normal standard low-rise housing density of villas and townhouses. They're often rented out informally, so there is more loss of tenant protection on informal rental markets. So this is one of the typologies that we have documented in terms of what is happening within various suburbs of Sydney. So this is the primary dwelling, as you can see, and these are granny flats. So you can see a row of similar type of primary dwellings and granny flats. So this is the outcome of this is the type of sort of calculated informality that we are seeing in suburbs of Sydney. In terms of affordability outcome, so like I mentioned before, there's no monitoring of how it can be affordable, how these granny flats can be affordable, and there is no monitoring of where the rent is going. Is it going to an extended family? Is it being Airbnb'd, or is it going for low-cost rentals? So there is definitely, there's evidence that, and we have also done some secondary earlier studies to show that there is an informal rental market for secondary dwellings. However, there is no compliance requirements as well. So there is compliance requirements, but within the dwellings that have been advertised, it looks like they are definitely non-compliant. And from our earlier studies, there are definite evidence of secondary dwellings being used for informal or non-compliant occupancies. So these are some of the forms that we have seen, and these are advertised within real estate websites publicly available. So these are the kind of transformation that we see. And this is the kind of calculated informality, if we say, being produced within various geographies within Sydney. In terms of preliminary conclusion, what we say is that it has enabled the market to increase supply of new dwellings, potentially new, often unregulated sector of the rental market. There is outcomes of lower income renters. Well, this is still an ongoing research, so we are sort of unclear as to the extent of how they have been used. And deregulation of planning control and privatized enforcement may have eroded some residential standards. So as you can see with the images and our documentation, there has definitely been some erosion of residential standards. And what we sort of going back to Roy's unregulated and deregulated systems within housing practices, coming back to Jake and Wigman as well. What we have done here as part of our conclusion is that we've said that there was unregulated systems, which is mostly the self-help. It can be either non-market self-help or the market. These are examples where it is unpermitted. This is the informal rental market, whereas the regulated system is where the state regulation and laws promote public interest, and there is some sense of enforcement. These are examples of planned permitted rental dwellings. So this is the regulated system, and what we say is the unregulated housing system would be the relaxation of control standards, so intended to enable market activities, often involve sets of new codes, industry enforcement. Examples include fast-track housing approval, as of right provision, secondary dwellings, and codes. And as our research is showing so far, it has, to an extent, created some sort of calculated informality and contributed to create market-enabled informal housing market. As well, this is very preliminary at this stage, but what we are arguing for is a sort of a revision to the secondary dwelling rules to address local concerns that we have documented from local council as well as private developers, strengthening of enforcement in terms of illegal dwellings which are threatening residents and are unsafe for habitat, and increase in direct support for affordable rental housing through social housing and income subsidies, and rental protection for tenants. So what we are in many ways arguing for is if we go back to our earlier slide of unregulated, regulated, and deregulated systems, what we're saying is that there is a lack of protection here. There is some sort of protection here, and deregulated system is, in many ways, there is a loss of protection. And here what we are arguing for is that bringing back the protection for residents of these potentially informal, uninhabitable conditions, that tenants, basically bringing back the protection.